I'm going to talk to you about what I call the emerging spectrum of maritime security. Okay, so what I'm going to briefly touch on is the historical and contemporary views of maritime security. What is it? Where does it happen? The problems, and using a metaphor of the spectrum to describe maritime security. So from a historical perspective, and we've heard some of this from the previous speaker, Dr. Warren Matthews, trading by sea has been happening for thousands of years. Indeed, one of the best ways to prove this is it starts in the Bronze Age, because with very few exceptions, bronze, which is made from copper and tin, very few countries have copper and tin next to each other. So therefore they had to go to other parts of the world. And when you move the ore for copper or tin, you're unable to do that by land, because it's too heavy and too cumbersome. So therefore it went by ship. So we can therefore pretty much work out that that's when trade by sea really started. Now, the main areas of trading were the Mediterranean Sea, the Indus Valley and the Indian Ocean, South China Sea and the coast of China. And the routes were initially coastal, but this prompted opportunistic piracy and other maritime crimes, which grew over a while. Now, early piracy included raids ashore to plunder items. Indeed, Viking is the Scandinavian word for pirate. But as global shipping routes evolved, so did maritime crime. And there are a number of crimes that we link inextricably to sea, like piracy, privateering, smuggling, trafficking, and stowaways. This then justified the requirement for large navies that were able to dominate and police the shipping lanes, thereby reducing the crime. However, really since the beginning of the latest century, if not the middle of last century, we have seen, if you look at the graph on the right-hand side, and I'm only using the Royal Navy here because I haven't got the figures for all of the Navy's ships, but the Royal Navy is a good barometer. You can see the way in which the Royal Navy has declined since the Second World War. On the other hand, if you look on the left-hand slide, you can see the way in which trade has increased by sea since 1980. And there are, at the moment, estimated to be, or at the last United Nations Conference for Trade and Development, review of maritime transport, which comes out on an annual basis. Last one came out in November of last year. That there are almost 100,000 ships. So we'll be over 100,000 ships now of 100, at least 100 gross tons, which means that they are trading ships that can cross oceans if necessary. Whereas the Royal Navy currently has 31 commissioned warships of any reasonable size. So what we've seen is a massive increase in the number of ships and correspondingly a significant reduction in the number of warships to be able to protect and police the waterways. So contemporary perspective, maritime terrorism, the Al-Qaeda attack on USS Cole in 2000, a US ship in the port of Aden, and the Al-Qaeda attack on Mumbai in 2008, which was an amphibious raid. This is one of the areas. Piracy. I think piracy really hit the headlines and caught the imagination of people between 2008 2012, when pirates were taking ships and kidnapping effectively or holding the crew hostage for large ransoms. That was suppressed by a number of measures, but piracy continues in the Gulf of Guinea and indeed in Southeast Asia. It's not exactly the same format or model, but the fact is, it is piracy. Smuggling and trafficking, it is rampant. And as Dr. Matthews said, we have had a massive increase in the amount of trade moving by sea, and at the same time, we've had an enormous amount of, or an enormous increase in the volume of items being smuggled and trafficked, because there's more ships, more opportunities for it to be moved around the world. Mass maritime migration, for those of us who live in Europe, and I'm sitting here in Melbourne right now, but I'm an Englishman. We have seen some heartbreaking moments of people trying to get from horrible situations like Afghanistan, Syria, etc., to the far more affluent European countries. And that is something which is likely to continue, certainly for the foreseeable future. But it does throw into, makes it very hard for shipping companies to actually get on with what they're meant to be doing. And illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. This is a global problem. And not only does it cost the global economy a lot of money, but it is decimating the ecosystem in the oceans, which could have significant impacts further down the line. Looking at securities specifically, the shipping industry wasn't really focusing on security. However, the 9/11 attacks in the United States in 2001 brought it into sharp focus. And the International Maritime Organization, as some would say, bullied by the US. I think that's a very strong word, but they were certainly encouraged by the US to have a code for the for international shipping and port facilities in order to prevent terrorists using ships in order to be able to attack ports around the world. It's worked thus far, and it has also certainly reduced the amount of other crimes going on in ports as well. However, on the other side, it has meant that there's a lot more fraud and corruption going on in ports. Now, the 9/11 attacks prompted the US government to review all types of security. As I've said, they introduced the International Ship and Port or Facility Security Code, or the ISPS code. And in 2005, they drew up the Maritime Operational Threat Response Plan. And it was in this plan that for the first time, really, maritime security is looked at as a separate area of security. And as it says here, used by all, owned by none. However, maritime security wasn't necessarily a defined term. In the ISPS code, it is not defined as a term. And in 2008, the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, reported to the Oceans and Law of the Sea meeting, there is no universally accepted definition of the term maritime security. He went on to say most definitions of maritime security also usually include security from crimes at sea, such as piracy, armed robbery against ships, and terrorist acts. But he also wanted to add in the unlawful damage to the marine environment, which is becoming progressively more important now, including from illegal dumping, the discharge of pollutants from vessels, and the depletion of natural resources, such as RUU fishing, which I've talked about already, that can also threaten the interests of states. So it has gained a lot more of a higher profile. And indeed, as we go into a more environmentally sensitive period, this is becoming far more important to many people. Now, a number of people have come up with various ideas. In 2013, David Sloggett came up with 7 dimensions of maritime security, and he talked about state on state, which we're seeing right now between Ukraine and Russia. And of course, what we've been talking about with Dr. Matthews was what's happening in the South China Sea between China and various other states. Trade protection, which I'll talk about in a minute, maritime resources management, smuggling, terrorism, disasters, natural and man-made, and oceanography. Various academics have examined this and tried to come up with their own way of looking at it. Dr. Christian Buger, who is instrumental in doing a lot, actually, as far as this is concerned, came up with this matrix that he then added to with another academic, Timothy Edmonds, in 2020. So you can see within this matrix, he's pulling out more angles than Dave Sloggett. And then in 2020, he's looking at how it is all interconnected. It's got limitability, it's transnational, and it's cross-jurisdictional, all of which are absolutely true. Now, Dirk Siebels tried to bring out a positive aim to it, looking that if we protect our maritime trade, we look after the security of offshore oil and gas production, which would now also include offshore mining of metals and also biotechnology, the protection of fishing grounds, ocean governance and regional cooperation, regulation cooperation with private security, other aspects that we can then encourage economic development, and indeed that will provide a degree of economic protection for us. Now, Professor Till, who is a very highly acclaimed and respected academic who looks at sea power, brackets warships, used his own simplistic, and I mean that in a complimentary way, not in a critical way at all, of just looking at it as good order at sea. But he did go on to say that it is complex, intrinsically difficult, requires extensive naval as well as Coast Guard involvement, and can only be achieved with an all-round maritime approach, which is one of the key elements here, in so much as this has to be a multi-agency challenge. And when we think about it, many countries like the United Kingdom and indeed Australia, where I live right now, is absolutely dependent on maritime trade in order, certainly Australia, for all of our exports, iron ore, coal, etc., around the world, and indeed our imports as a more or less a non-manufacturing country. So, but it has to be, so that would be the whole economy of the country is absolutely dependent upon maritime trade. It isn't just the Department for Transport or whoever looks after the maritime domain and defence. So therefore, I'm offering my idea for those of you who are slightly more mature in my kind of age bracket, if not a little bit older. You will recognize this iconic image from an old vinyl record album called by Pink Floyd called Dark Side of the Moon. But it brings out really what is the spectrum of maritime security. And if you look at this, the white light is what I call traditional maritime security. And this is really what it was up until the end of the Second World War, where we had large navies, and it was their ability to dominate and police the waterways that meant that maritime crime was manageable and was kept in one place. Not kept in one place, but was manageable and could be policed effectively. However, modern maritime crime is that white light having gone through the glass prism and being dispersed into the spectrum. Therefore, it's the spectrum of maritime security. And I'll elaborate on this slightly. So here we are. Here's the spectrum of the colors, going from red through to violet. So the first area, and using Dave Sloggett's type or method, his 7 dimensions, because we have 7 colors. Red would be state on state. As I said, as we're seeing in the Black Sea between Russia and the Ukraine, and indeed the South China Sea and various other places around the world. Protection of trade, which isn't just shipping. It does include ports. If you don't have ports, you can't have shipping. And indeed submarine communications. What I mean by that is not talking submarines underwater, it is submarine cables. More than 98% of all our internet connections, and I am right now talking to you via a submarine cable that has come all the way from Australia to Oxford. So they are absolutely crucial to what we do as well. The management of ocean resources, fossil fuels, extraction, fishing, undersea mining, and as I said, biotechnology, which are the technologies that are going to allow us, hopefully, in the future to be able to get food and pharmaceuticals by utilizing sea life and plants in the water. Smuggling, trafficking, mass migration and stowaways, which I've talked about already. Terrorism at sea or facilitated by the maritime domain. So there have been attacks on ships, cruise liners even, one in 1961 and another one in 1985, or facilitated by the maritime domain, which would typically be the USS Cole incident, which I talked about earlier on, or the attack on Mumbai. Disasters, man-made and natural. Oceanography. But where do emerging threats and technologies fit into this? The altering dynamics of the maritime industry, it's growing at a rough rate at about 3 to 3.5%. Cybersecurity, blockchain, 5G, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, use of drones, autonomous shipping. The maritime industry is developing very quickly. Where does corruption, fraud, extortion, which I haven't talked about, where does that fit in? And the altering geopolitical balance, and last but by no means least, climate change. Now, remembering that the spectrum of light.
Able to take a couple of questions, please, because we're running out of time.
Yes, by all means.
Anyone from the floor who would like to ask some questions, please?
It's not a carry on, it's finishing.
Okay, Professor, that's okay. We've just got a couple of minutes left, please, if you'd like to carry on then.
By all means, right, thank you. So I think that, as you can see here, the spectrum is visible, but a lot of the it is not. And so therefore, climate change and the others would sit there as they do. But also just remember that the spectrum blends and melds. One color becomes another. And so it's constantly changing rather than being static. It is not static, it's changing all the time. And everybody's interpretation of it is different. And just another example, what's the difference between the two rainbows here? Well, the first one goes one way, and the second one, so the first one would go red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, and the other one would go violet, violet, indigo, blue, and the other way around. So that's just an example of how things change quickly. Or to put it another way, no matter whether you're an admiral, seafarer, commercial ship owner, offshore platform manager, fisherman, criminal terrorist, shipping lawyer, marine insurance, underwriter, victim of a devastating maritime disaster in Ireland or in the South Pacific, watching the inexorable rise in the sea levels threatening to inundate your home, maritime security is likely to mean very different things to you. So there we go. Maritime security has a concern since seaborne trade started. It's different thing. It means different things to different people. It is managed on land and implemented on the water. Requires a multi-agency response. Using the analogy of the spectrum can help us to understand the scope of maritime security. And I think the one thing that I would finish off by saying is that this is going to be a maritime century, and therefore maritime security is going to be crucial to the way in which we conduct business. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much.